The wind had teeth that winter. It bit through wool, through bone, through the last scraps of pride a person might try to keep warm with. Sheridan, Wyoming Territory, 1883. Nothing but ice, dust, and people who pretended not to see suffering when it passed them on the street. The sky hung low and white, the kind of sky that made a man feel buried alive under daylight. Nita Hale stood outside Thornton's Dry Goods, the last store in town, clutching an empty willow basket against her stomach. Her fingers were cracked and raw from the cold, her shawl threadbare, her breath a pale ghost in the air. She was Apache, small, strong, and dark as the earth that the settlers here had torn open and claimed as their own. Her black eyes, steady and proud, didn't fit into this place any more than the frozen tumbleweed rolling down Main Street. Inside, the light was warm, spilling golden over sacks of flour and barrels of salt pork. But the warmth wasn't meant for her. The shopkeeper, Samuel Thornton, stood behind the counter in his pressed vest, his voice sharp enough to slice through the glass. "I said no credit, Mrs. Hale. You people never pay it back." He said, "You people," like it was a sickness. Nita tried to steady her voice. "It's just until spring. My boy, he hasn't eaten since yesterday." The words came out thin, half frozen, and she hated the sound of them. Begging. The other women in the store turned their heads slightly, pretending to browse bolts of calico, pretending not to hear. She'd once sat beside them in church back when her husband was alive, back when she still had a name worth saying. Thornton leaned forward, resting both hands on the counter. "Your husband's dead, and so's his pension. You got nothing to pay with but promises, and promises don't buy flour." The heat left her face. "Please," she whispered, "I can work. Clean, mend, whatever you need." Thornton's mouth twitched, something between pity and disgust. "Don't need help from your kind." And with that, he shut the door on her. The sound was solid and final, like the lid closing on a coffin. For a long moment, Nita didn't move. She could feel the stares pressing against her back through the windows, pale faces behind frosted glass. The air stung her lungs as she forced herself to straighten. She turned slowly, walking down the wooden steps, her boots creaking over the frozen boards. Snow flurried off the rooftops and settled on her hair. Each step felt heavier than the last. Somewhere 3 miles south, her boy Eli was waiting, probably poking at the embers of their fire, hoping she'd bring something home. Across the street, a man leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long canvas coat dusted with snow. His hat shadowed his face, but the lines of it were cut from work and weather, not ease. He watched her, not like the others, not with curiosity or judgment, but with the calm of someone who understood hunger when he saw it. Colt Mercer owned Red Creek Ranch, a stretch of land 10 miles out past the Cottonwoods. Folks said he'd built it himself, one fence post at a time. No help, no partner. He'd been poor once too, that kind of poor that leaves a mark no money ever scrubs away. And as he watched the Apache widow clutch her empty basket and walk away from the only store in town, something old stirred in him. The memory of a winter long ago, a boy with frost-bitten hands, a stranger who didn't ask questions, just handed him a crust of bread and said, "You'll make it, but you'll remember this." He had. Now, as Nita passed him without a glance, Colt's jaw tightened. Snow hissed across the street like dry sand. Somewhere behind him, the saloon piano faltered into silence. He straightened, pulled his gloves tight, and stepped off the porch. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice low enough to cut through the wind without raising it. Nita stopped, shoulders stiffening. Colt tipped his hat. "You got a child at home?" She hesitated, then nodded once. His gaze didn't waver. "Ride with me," he said. "I'll fill your table tonight." And though every warning her mother ever taught her screamed no, Nita looked into those pale, steady eyes and saw no pity there, only a simple truth. The wagon creaked like old bones as it rolled out of Sheridan, its wheels grinding over frozen ruts. The wind had settled into a mean whisper, the kind that found every tear in a person's coat and slipped right through. Nita sat stiff beside Colt Mercer, hands locked around her basket, as if the emptiness inside it might still protect her somehow. The canvas flap behind them snapped in the cold, and the horse's breath rose in pale ghosts. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that she'd said yes, a word she hadn't trusted in a long time. Colt held the reins loose in his calloused hands, guiding the team with quiet precision. He didn't talk, didn't stare, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. The only sounds were the rhythm of hooves, the creak of harness leather, and the faint hum he made under his breath. A tune with no name, old and weathered like him. After a while, Nita found her voice, rough from disuse. "You don't know me," she said. Colt nodded, eyes fixed on the road. "Don't need to." She frowned. "Then why help me?" He thought for a moment, jaw working like he was chewing on something heavier than tobacco. "Because hunger's an old enemy of mine," he said. "And I don't care what color your skin is or what name you go by. It just takes." Nita glanced at him, trying to read the man beneath the hat brim. He looked younger than the burden in his voice, mid-30s maybe, with a few gray threads along his temples. His coat was patched but clean, boots scuffed but cared for. A man who worked hard and didn't complain about it. They passed the last fence post marking the edge of town. Beyond it stretched miles of white prairie, the snow lying flat and endless under a bruised sky. Nita tightened her shawl and lowered her eyes. "People will talk," she said quietly. Colt gave a dry little laugh. "People always talk. Keeps them warm." That almost pulled a smile from her. Almost. He flicked the reins gently. "Trading post 2 miles east. Old man Jensen runs it. Don't ask questions, don't judge. You'll get what you need there." She hesitated. "I've got no money to pay you back." Colt's answer was soft but certain. "Didn't ask for any." That shut her up for a while. She watched his profile against the gray light, the way the wind tugged at the collar of his coat, the way his eyes seemed to look straight through the horizon. There was something about him, something steady, like a man who'd been tested by the world and hadn't broken. After a stretch of silence, Colt spoke again, voice low enough to blend with the wind. "I was 8 when my pa died," he said. "Mine collapsed outside Leadville. My ma tried to keep us fed, me and my 2 sisters. Didn't work out. Winter came, and we ran out of everything but pride." Nita listened, her fingers going still on her basket. "One morning," Colt continued, "a ranch foreman passed through town, saw us sitting outside the church steps. My ma couldn't bring herself to beg, but she couldn't stop crying either. The man didn't say much, just asked if I could work a stable, fed me that night, gave me a bed of straw, sent half my wages home every month. Kept us alive." He shrugged, the leather reins squeaking under his grip. "Ain't forgotten him. Figured the least I can do is pass it on when I get the chance." Nita stared ahead, the prairie stretching endless before them. Her throat tightened, not from cold this time, but from something heavier. "No one ever helped me without wanting something back," she said. Colt's voice came quiet and sure. "Then maybe this is a first." The wagon dipped as they crossed a frozen creek, the horses snorting in the cold. The trading post came into view, a squat log building with smoke curling from its crooked chimney. A lantern glowed in the small window, soft and amber against the gray. Colt pulled the team to a stop and climbed down, his boots crunching in the snow. "Wait here," he said, then hesitated. "You trust me enough for that?" Nita met his gaze. For the first time in years, someone was asking her instead of telling her. She nodded. "I do." Colt tipped his hat once, like that meant something, and headed inside. Nita watched him go, this stranger who'd stepped out of nowhere and changed the shape of her world with 9 simple words. "Ride with me. I'll fill your table tonight." She looked down at her basket, empty no longer. For the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the road ahead wasn't meant to end in hunger. The wagon rolled steady through the open white, wheels crunching against frozen dirt. The sky stretched flat and endless, the kind that made a man feel small even when he'd worked his whole life to stand tall. Snow covered everything, fence posts, sagebrush, even the broken bones of old homesteads half buried in the drifts. Nita Hale sat beside Colt Mercer, her shawl drawn tight, her breath fogging in the air. The wind stung her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that pain was just another kind of weather. You endured it until it passed. Colt's voice broke the silence, low and rough as gravel. I was 8 when I got my first taste of real hunger, he said. Not the kind where you miss a meal, the kind that makes your stomach forget how to hurt. Nita turned slightly, watching the way his hands gripped the reins. Steady, calm. My pa worked a mine near Leadville, he went on. One winter it collapsed. He was inside, never came out. My ma tried to keep us alive, me and my sisters. But there wasn't work for widows, not the kind that paid in anything but shame. He let out a humorless laugh. We went 5 days without food once. 5? The snow didn't care. Neither did the town. He adjusted his hat against the glare. Then one morning a man rode through. Foreman on a ranch down south. He saw us sitting outside the church steps. My ma, too proud to beg, but too broke to stand. He didn't ask questions, just told her he'd take me along, give me food, bed, and wages sent home every month. She said yes before I could blink. Nita's heart tightened. She could see it. The boy he'd been, small and hungry, bundled in rags, watching a stranger ride away with his future. Worked that ranch 7 years, Colt said. Learned to ride, mend fences, break horses, patch wounds. Learned what a man's word's supposed to mean. That foreman saved my life, not by feeding me once, but by teaching me how to feed myself. He looked out across the frozen plain. So now, when I see someone starving, I can't walk past. I reckon that's just the deal I made with the world. The wind swept snow off the ridges, swirling it like smoke. Nita's hands loosened around the basket resting on her lap. Most men don't think that way, she said softly. Colt shrugged. Most men ain't been that hungry. They rode on in silence, the horses breathing hard, steam rising from their backs. The sun dipped behind a bank of gray clouds, painting the snow a dull gold. Nita glanced at Colt. His profile was carved sharp in the light. The strong jaw, the scar along his neck, the calm that sat deep in his eyes. He didn't look at her like the others did. Didn't see a burden or a scandal or a half-blood widow left to rot on the edge of town. He saw her the way he saw everything else on this land, something that deserved a fair chance to survive. She studied him a moment longer before turning away, whispering almost to herself, "You're a strange man, Colt Mercer." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. Been called worse. The wagon hit a patch of ice, jolting hard. Colt caught the reins, steadying the horses. "You all right?" Nita nodded, clutching the seat. "Been through worse," she murmured. "Yeah," Colt said quietly. "Reckon we both have." They shared a look then, brief, wordless, something fragile passing between them like the flicker of firelight in a cold room. For the first time since her husband died, Nita felt seen, not for what she'd lost, but for what she still carried. The trading post came into view ahead, smoke curling from its crooked chimney, the smell of wood fire carried on the wind. Colt slowed the team, his voice soft but sure. "You'll get what you need here, Nita. Food, coffee, flour, enough to last a spell." She swallowed, eyes fixed on the little cabin of light in the distance. "Why are you really doing this, Colt?" He looked at her then, his gaze steady as the earth. "Because someone once looked at me the way I'm looking at you now, and decided I was worth saving." Nita didn't answer. She didn't have to. The wagon rolled on toward the smoke, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the cold quite so deep. The trading post sat hunched against the cold like an old dog, its logs darkened by decades of wind and smoke, its sign half buried under snow. A lantern swung above the door, throwing a trembling amber glow into the gray afternoon. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop. The horses pawed the ground, snorting steam. Nita hesitated, one hand gripping the edge of the seat. This was the kind of place she'd learned to avoid. She could still hear her late husband's warning echoing in her mind. They see Apache blood. They see trouble. Colt climbed down first, his boots crunching in the crusted snow. "Stay close," he said, not as a command but as a courtesy. "Jensen's decent folk mostly. He'll treat you square." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pine smoke and animal hides. Shelves leaned heavy with goods, coffee tins, lanterns, rolls of cloth, salt pork hanging from the rafters. Behind the counter stood Elias Jensen, a broad man with white whiskers and the calm eyes of someone who'd seen too much to bother with prejudice. Colt laid a bundle of furs on the counter. 2 coyote pelts, 1 good fox. $4 in food, he said, his voice even. For the lady. Jensen looked from Colt to Nita. Her hands stayed clasped at her waist, shawl drawn tight, eyes steady but wary. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moaning through the cracks in the wall. Then Jensen nodded slowly. I reckon I can do that. He began to weigh flour, measure beans, pack salt and coffee into brown paper sacks. No questions, no looks, just the rhythm of work, the scrape of a scoop, the fold of paper, the tie of string. Nita stood silent, uncertain whether to thank him or not. Gratitude was dangerous in places like this. It made you smaller. But the quiet respect in Jensen's movements, the way he didn't flinch from her presence, did something she hadn't expected. It eased the knot in her chest. Colt leaned on the counter, watching. When Jensen slid the parcels toward him, Colt counted out the furs worth without haggling. Appreciate it, he said. Jensen wiped his hands on his apron. Always figured decency ought to be worth more'n money, he muttered. Colt's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Ain't no shame in needing help, he said. The shame's in not giving it. Nita's gaze flicked to him. The words hit harder than he knew. All her life, she'd been made to believe that needing meant weakness, that asking meant surrender. But the way Colt said it, quiet and sure, turned the thought inside out. When they stepped back outside, the wind had softened. The light was fading into that pale blue just before dusk. Colt loaded the parcels into the wagon bed, then turned to her. You'll eat good tonight, he said simply. Nita looked down at the bundles. Flour, beans, salt, coffee. Ordinary things. Yet they felt heavier than gold. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. You didn't have to do this. Colt met her eyes, his breath a cloud in the cold air. Maybe not, he said, but I reckon someone ought to. He helped her climb onto the wagon, then took the reins. As the horses started forward, the sound of the bells on their harnesses mingled with the wind. Behind them, the glow of Jensen's lantern faded into the snow, and for the first time in months, Nita Hale felt something she thought she'd buried with her husband. The small, stubborn warmth of being treated like a person again. By the time the wagon reached the creek, dusk had turned the world to smoke and silver. The wind funneled down from the hills, sharp and restless, carrying the smell of pine and frozen mud. Nita pointed through the dim light. There, she said quietly. Colt followed her gaze. A crooked cabin hunched beside the stream, half wall missing a plank, chimney leaning like a drunk, smoke barely whispering from its mouth. It looked more like a ghost than a home. When the wagon stopped, a small figure burst from the doorway. Eli, all ribs and eyes, ran barefoot through the snow. Mama! He cried, his voice cracked with both relief and hunger. Nita jumped down before Colt could help her. She caught the boy in her arms, pressing his face against her coat. He was light, too light. Colt turned away for a moment, pretending to check the horses. When she looked back at him, her chin lifted slightly. Come in, she said. It wasn't an invitation. It was courage pretending not to be afraid. The inside of the cabin smelled of smoke and old ashes. 1 cot, 1 stool, 1 pot. No table, no comfort. The wind sneaked through the gaps in the boards, humming low and mean. Colt crouched by the hearth and coaxed the coals back to life. Within minutes, orange light spilled across the walls, painting them in trembling warmth. He unpacked the parcels, flour, beans, salt, coffee, and set a small iron pot on the fire. You got water from the creek? He asked. Nita nodded, still holding Eli close. Enough for tonight. Good. Aram, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a skinned rabbit. Traded this on the way. Eli's eyes widened. Real meat? Colt grinned faintly. Last time I checked. The scent of rabbit stew filled the cabin as the meat sizzled and the flour thickened. Colt worked in silence, moving with the ease of a man who'd cooked for himself more years than he'd shared a meal with anyone. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was almost musical against the storm outside. Nita watched him from the shadows. The firelight threw his face into 100 small stories. Scar along his jaw, soot on his cheek, a furrow between his brows that never quite smoothed. She realized then he wasn't the kind of man who'd ever had much given to him. Everything about him spoke of earned survival, slow, patient, honest. When the stew was ready, Colt ladled it into tin bowls. Eli's hands trembled as he took his share. "Go on, kid," Colt said softly. "Eat." The boy didn't need telling twice. Nita ate slower, almost reverent. Each bite was heavy with warmth, with disbelief. She hadn't tasted food this good since before her husband died, before the world turned cold to her kind. The heat reached her chest, spread to her fingertips, and she realized her hands were shaking not from cold, but from something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered. Colt looked up, his spoon pausing midair. "Don't thank me for feeding folks that need feeding. Just makes us even with the world." She studied him through the flicker of the fire, through the thin veil of smoke curling toward the rafters. In that light, he looked almost unreal, part man, part memory of every kindness she'd stopped believing existed. Eli finished his bowl and leaned against her, already half asleep. Nita brushed a hand through his tangled hair and looked across the fire. Colt sat back, quiet, watching the flames like they held answers. His eyes glowed a soft, tired gold. There was sorrow in them and solitude, but also something else. Mercy, maybe. Nita thought, this man has seen hell and come back kind. Outside, the wind howled across the empty hills. Inside, the stew bubbled low, the fire sighed, and for one fragile night, hunger was a thing that lived only in memory. The wind came first, thin and sharp as a blade, then the snow, heavy and relentless. By nightfall, the sky was gone, swallowed by white. The storm moved down the valley like a living thing, roaring through the trees, slamming against the roof of the little cabin until the boards moaned in protest. Inside, Colt Mercer worked by lantern light. His shadow stretched across the walls, tall and steady, hammering planks against the holes where daylight used to creep through. Each strike of the nail echoed through the cabin like a heartbeat fighting back against the wind. Nita held the lantern for him, her shawl drawn tight, the light trembling in her hands. "It's bad," she said quietly. "I've never heard it this wild." Colt grunted, setting another nail. "This country's mean when it wants to be. Best thing you can do is outlast it." When he finished patching the worst of the roof, he went outside, braced against the storm, and split a stack of wood under the porch. The axe rose and fell in a rhythm as steady as breathing, flakes of snow clinging to his coat, melting into the lines of his face. From the doorway, Nita watched him, the lantern light spilling across the drifting snow. For a moment, she saw not a stranger, but something older, a force of nature as stubborn and grounded as the mountains themselves. When he finally came back in, boots caked with frost, he stacked the wood beside the fire and kicked the door shut. The wind howled against it, but the latch held. Colt leaned his back to the wall and took off his gloves, flexing fingers red from cold. "We'll make it through," he said simply. Nita nodded. "You could have gone back to your ranch before it hit." "Could have," he said, crouching by the fire to stir the embers. "Didn't seem right." Eli slept on a pile of blankets by the hearth, his face soft in the glow. The boy's breathing was slow, peaceful. It was the first night in months he'd slept without waking from hunger or cold. Colt looked down at him, and a quiet gentleness came over his face. "He's tougher than most men I've known," he murmured. Nita smiled faintly. "He's had to be." They sat in silence after that, listening to the storm tear at the world outside. The roof creaked, the fire hissed, the wind screamed through the pines, and still inside that cabin, warmth held its ground. Colt fed another log to the fire. Sparks rose, orange and defiant. "I've seen winters like this break, folks," he said softly. "Takes more than food or wood to keep going. Takes a reason." Nita turned her gaze from the flames to him. "And what's yours?" He hesitated, eyes fixed on the fire. "Maybe making sure nobody freezes the way I once did." For a long time, neither spoke. The storm beat itself raw against the hills, but its fury felt distant, muffled by the steady crackle of burning pine. Nita studied Colt's hands, scarred, rough, honest hands. The smell of smoke and earth clung to him, the kind of scent that only belonged to men who worked, not talked. His shoulders were broad, his movements careful, like he was always mindful not to break what was fragile. Outside, the night was merciless. But in that small cabin, the world had narrowed to firelight, breath, and the quiet rhythm of trust being born. Eli stirred in his sleep, mumbling something, and Nita tucked the blanket around him. When she looked up again, Colt had leaned back in his chair, half asleep, his hat tipped low, the fire painting his face in gold. Something warm, dangerously warm, unfolded in her chest. The wind still raged, the house still creaked, but inside that fragile shell of wood and faith, Nita Hale understood something she hadn't dared believe in a long, long time. Not every man who walks into a storm means to leave. Some come just to keep the fire burning. Word travels fast on cold wind. By the week's end, every gossiping mouth in Sheridan had found a new fire to feed. The ranchers keeping an Apache woman. Some said it with disgust, others with glee, but all said it loud enough for Colt Mercer to hear. He didn't waste breath on rumors. There was too much to do, splitting wood, tending horses, keeping the fire alive for Nita and her boy. Yet he felt the eyes on him when he rode into town. Whispers trailed him down the boardwalk like smoke from a bad chimney. At first, he let it roll off. But poison never stays quiet for long. By the fourth morning, a wagon came up the ridge toward the cabin, 3 men riding beside it. The lead horse belonged to Samuel Thornton, his fine coat buttoned tight, face red with self-importance. Beside him rode Sheriff Garrett, stocky and stone-faced, and another man Colt didn't know, carrying a Winchester across his saddle. Colt saw them from the porch, set down his axe and wiped his hands on his coat. The snow creaked under their boots as they dismounted. "Morning," Colt said evenly, voice calm as a still river. Thornton spat into the snow. "We need a word, Mercer." Garrett's tone was clipped. "There's talk in town. People are saying you've taken that Apache woman into your home. That true?" Colt's eyes didn't flicker. "Ain't anyone else's concern who I share a roof with." Thornton sneered. "She's an Indian widow, Mercer. You know what folks will think? You got a ranch to run, a name to keep. You're setting a poor example." "Wish her," Garrett shifted, clearing his throat like he wanted to sound reasonable. "I ain't here to pass judgment, Colt, but you're stirring the town up. Men are angry. Women won't let their kids near the school if she's around." Colt looked past them, toward the snow blowing off the ridge, then back. Those same men ever bring her food when her boy was starving? Those women ever offer a kind word? Thornton's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." Colt took a step forward, voice steady but hard as an anvil. "They don't feed her boy. Their words don't matter." The silence that followed was thick enough to break with a knife. The wind caught the edge of Colt's coat and snapped it against his legs. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Nita stepped out, her shawl drawn close but her spine straight as a fence post. The snow swirled around her hair, black against white. Thornton turned, eyes narrowing. "You should stay inside, miss." Nita's voice cut through the air, clear and sharp. "The same town that let us starve dares to preach decency?" Garrett's hand twitched near his hat, but he didn't raise it. The third man looked away, shame creeping up his neck. Thornton flushed deep red. "You'd best watch that tongue, woman." Colt moved without raising his voice, stepping between them, his presence quiet but immovable. "You said your piece," he told Thornton. "Now get off my land." Garrett sighed, looking from one to the other. "Let it be, Sam. It's his place." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thornton turned sharply, muttering under his breath as he mounted. The others followed, the wagon wheels groaning as they rolled back toward town. When they were gone, the snow swallowed the sound of their retreat. Nita stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling. "You didn't have to." "Yeah," Colt said softly, still watching the empty trail. "I did." The wind eased. The world went quiet except for the faint crackle of the fire inside. Nita looked at him, this man who'd risked his reputation, his standing, for nothing more than what was right. The pride of her ancestors stirred in her chest, mingling with something gentler. For the first time, they stood not as charity and savior, not as rancher and widow, but as two people the world had decided didn't belong. And out there, beneath the sweeping white sky, it felt like belonging enough. The storm broke 3 days later, leaving the world washed in silver and silence. Snow draped over every fence post, every tree limb, every sign that life had once moved through the valley. When the sun came out again, it gleamed like glass on the frozen creek beside the cabin. Colt Mercer came back from town with a wagon full of lumber, nails, and something else wrapped in burlap, a pane of real window glass. He unloaded the supplies with quiet purpose while Nita and Eli watched from the doorway. "You planning to build a barn or a church?" Nita asked, half teasing, half wary. Colt looked up at her with that faint, unreadable smile. "Neither," he said. "Just a home. Can't have one without light." He set to work without ceremony. The hammer rang out, sure and steady, each strike measured like a man setting the rhythm of his own heart. Nita joined him, holding boards in place, fetching nails from the box. She'd built shelters before, with her late husband, with her tribe before that. But this time, the work felt different. This wasn't survival, it was rebuilding. Eli scurried between them, his laughter echoing across the yard. He handed Colt nails and tried to copy his motions with a stick. "You swing your arm like this, right?" "Close enough," Colt said, grinning. "But if you hit your thumb, don't say I didn't warn you." By midday, the sound of hammering filled the cold air. Together, they patched the walls, mended the door, and reinforced the roof that had nearly given way during the storm. The wind still sang through the pines, but inside those walls, it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like company. When they finished the exterior, Colt hauled in the frame for a new horse shed beside the cabin. "If you're gonna stay through spring," he said, "you'll need somewhere to keep the mare warm." Nita wiped sweat and sawdust from her brow. "And if you're gonna stay through spring?" Colt paused, driving the last nail home. "Guess I'll find something to do around here." That night, as the snow began to fall again, the cabin glowed like an ember in the dark. The new window reflected the soft light of a single oil lamp. Inside, Eli practiced tying knots with a length of rope, his small fingers fumbling but determined. Colt knelt beside him, showing him how to loop and pull, his patience endless. "Are you staying, Mr. Mercer?" the boy asked suddenly. Colt leaned back, eyes warm beneath the brim of his hat. "For a while," he said. "Maybe longer if your mama lets me." Eli grinned. "She will." Across the room, Nita pretended not to hear, but her heart stuttered all the same. She stood near the window, watching Colt as he gathered his tools. The lamplight threw gold across his shoulders, across the quiet strength in his movements. He was a man made of work and weather, rough, patient, and steady. And for the first time since her husband's death, the sound of a man moving around her home didn't make her flinch. It made her feel safe. Later, when Colt stepped outside to check the horses, Nita stood in the doorway, watching him through the gentle curtain of falling snow. He moved slowly, lantern swinging at his side, his breath clouding in the night air. Something in her, something buried deep beneath grief and pride, shifted. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that burns bright and fast. It was quieter, older, like the slow thaw of spring under a hard frost. And as the light from Colt's lantern flickered through the glass he'd set that morning, Nita realized something she hadn't dared think before. Maybe the world had taken everything from her, so it could give her this. A man who didn't speak promises, but built them, one nail at a time. Christmas Eve came quiet and white. The valley lay under a blanket of snow, the pines heavy and still, their shadows stretching long across the frozen creek. Smoke rose from the chimney of Nita Hale's cabin, curling into the night like a fragile prayer. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. The room smelled of pine resin and coffee, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from heat alone. Colt Mercer sat by the hearth, knife in hand, whittling something small and careful from a block of wood. His sleeves were rolled up, his forearms dusted with fine shavings. Every now and then, he'd glance at Nita, who was mending Eli's coat in the lamplight. The boy was already asleep, curled under the quilt by the fire. Outside, wind sighed through the trees, carrying faint bells from the church in town. Too far to reach, too distant to matter. When Colt finished, he brushed the wood dust off his lap and turned toward her. "Got something for you?" he said softly. Nita looked up, surprised. "For me?" He nodded and handed her the small object. It was a wooden comb, hand-carved, smooth as river stone, the handle etched with a tiny pattern of mountains and stars. Crude in places, but made with care. Nita's throat tightened. "You made this?" Colt shrugged, a faint grin ghosting across his lips. "Ain't much. Just figured every woman ought to have something pretty that's her own." Her hands trembled slightly as she ran her thumb along the carved ridges. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. Colt's gaze lingered on her face, on the flicker of firelight in her dark eyes. He shook his head. "You already did." The words hung there, soft and final. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the window, trying to listen in. Then Nita stood, crossing the small room in 2 careful steps. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rough stubble along his jaw. "You don't owe me kindness, Colt Mercer." He looked up at her, voice low and sure. "Ain't about owing, it's about choosing." She smiled, a small, broken thing stitched back together. Then she leaned down and kissed him. It was not the kind of kiss the storybooks promised. It was quiet, hesitant, tasting of smoke and salt and all the winters that had come before this one. But when her lips met his, something in both of them eased, the long ache of loneliness giving way to something gentler, something that felt like home. When she pulled back, the firelight danced in her eyes. Colt reached for her hand and held it, calloused fingers wrapping around hers as though it was the only thing keeping him steady. "I was born with nothing, Nita," he said, his voice barely above the crackle of the logs. "But right now, I've got a reason to stay." She didn't speak, didn't need to. The fire popped softly, throwing sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow kept falling. Slow, steady, relentless. But inside, the world was warm. Nita let her hand stay in his, their fingers intertwined on the worn wood of the table. The lamplight shimmered across their joined hands, across the comb beside them, across the small miracle of being seen and not judged. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel like something that belonged to other people. It felt like forgiveness. It felt like beginning. Spring didn't arrive all at once in the Wyoming territory. It crept in slow, like a tired traveler, testing each step before setting down its pack. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, curling away from the rocks and the edges of the stream until the ground began to breathe again. Outside Nita Hale's cabin, the first green blades of grass pushed through the frost, stubborn and brave. The creek ran stronger each morning, swollen with meltwater, carrying away what the winter had broken. Colt Mercer stood by the fence line with a hammer in his hand, sleeves rolled up, hair tousled by the wind. He was rebuilding the corral, plank by plank, same as he'd done with everything else that winter, quietly without complaint, like a man who'd finally found a place worth the work. Eli followed him, carrying nails in an old tin. "Here, Pa," the boy said without thinking, holding them out with both hands. The word hung in the air like sunlight through dust. Small, accidental, holy. Colt froze for a heartbeat, then looked down at the boy. "Say that again?" Eli's face went red. Sorry, I meant, Colt crouched, resting a big hand on the boy's shoulder. "No need to be sorry," he said softly. "Ain't a thing in this world I'd rather be called." Nita watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely around herself, the morning light catching in her dark hair. The sight of them, this man and her son working side by side, sent a warmth through her that no fire had ever given. Colt stood and brushed sawdust from his hands. "That garden patch behind the cabin, thinking we can plant by week's end? Beans, maybe corn if the frost stays gone." Nita smiled. "You sound like a man planning to stay." He glanced at her, one corner of his mouth curving up. "Maybe I am." Later, as the day stretched long and gold, they worked the soil together. The earth was cold but forgiving, breaking apart beneath their hands. The wind carried the smell of thawed pine and wet dirt. Every sound, the creak of the shovel, the soft splash of the stream, Eli's laughter chasing the chickens, felt like the world remembering how to live again. When the last light of evening settled, Colt stacked his tools by the porch and went inside. The fire still burned low in the hearth. Nita sat by it, mending a tear in his shirt. He stood behind her for a moment, just watching, then said quietly, "You know something, Nita? You were never charity." She turned, brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" He knelt beside her, voice steady and low. "When I first saw you in town, I told myself I was just helping, that it was about what's right. But truth is, you were the reason I stayed. You still are." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire, soft and steady. Then Nita reached out, her hand finding his. Their fingers laced together, calloused, warm, real. She didn't answer with words. She didn't have to. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the ridge. The snow was gone now, the land breathing again, alive with quiet promise. Colt looked toward the window where dusk painted the world in amber light. "Guess winter finally gave up," he said. Nita smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. Maybe it just found someplace better to stay. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, the rancher who had nothing, the Apache widow who had lost everything, they sat together in the small house they'd built with hands, hope, and second chances. Beyond the walls, spring hummed through the valley and the world began again. Two souls once left behind now found their home, not in the wide, wild west, but in each other.